So, Dr. Richard Swinburne, thank you for joining me today on Capturing Christianity. So, why don't we start by allowing you to sort of give an overview of your career as a philosopher, as a Christian philosopher, some of the important works that you've written, and that kind of thing. So,
Yes, well, my career has been a long one. I am now 83 years old. Uh, I started my philosophy as an undergraduate at Oxford University back in the 1950s, and in your American terminology, would be said to have majored in philosophy. And I then went on to a two-year graduate degree called the B.Phil in philosophy, which was all it was necessary to have in those days in order to teach in a university. I don't have an earned doctorate in any way; it wasn't necessary. And then I was lucky enough to have two research posts at that stage. And I was very conscious of the fact that the sort of philosophy I was learning about seemed to be totally insensitive to modern science. For example, people discussed free will without taking into account, well, maybe the universe wasn't deterministic and didn't quantum theory show anything. And quite independent of religious considerations, philosophy was not sensitive to modern science, and in particular, I was concerned that I was going on in philosophy because I believed that although it had its deficiencies, the then current philosophy, the method of careful and rigorous argument was crucial for Christian theology, and I thought philosophical techniques could help make Christianity acceptable. So I, for that reason, was going on into philosophy to learn some more philosophy. And it seemed to me in particular that Christians were proclaiming their views without taking serious attention to what science was saying in detail, both about quantum theory on the small scale and also about the large scale nature of the universe. And so I was saying I had a couple of research fellowships, one for 3 years, another one for 2 years, and I used these to try and understand science. I'd not learned much at school, and also really the history of science, why people had adopted this theory and rejected that theory, because once I had understood that, I could go on to what I thought was the case, that is to say, that you could establish the existence of God by just the same method, by just the same criteria as scientists use to establish their theories. But I wanted to be clear about what the criteria were for which scientists proposed their theories. So after a couple of research fellowships, I got my first philosophy job as a lecturer, in your terminology, an assistant professor and then an associate professor at the University of Hull. And all my teaching and all my writing wasn't on the philosophy of religion at all. It was on the philosophy of science. And I wrote two large and to some extent influential books. One on space and time, which was much concerned with what relativity theory had to say about the nature of space and nature of time, and then my book on confirmation theory. Confirmation theory is an analysis of the criteria by which certain evidence of different kinds makes theories of different kinds probable to different degrees. And I showed how the probability calculus could be used for that purpose. And this was a general book, wasn't particularly concerned with religion or even with science. I think the same criteria operate when detectives go to work for establishing which is the most probable person to have committed the murder. So I taught at Hull for 10 years, something like that. including at that stage my first period in the States. I taught for a year as a visitor at University of Maryland then, and then I moved on to being a professor at the University of Kiel, and I started to write about philosophy of religion, and I wrote 3 books by which I have become quite well known on theism, the doctrine there's a God, on the evidence for it, and on the relevance of such arguments. And these were called The Coherence of Theism, The Existence of God, and Faith and Reason. And they're all books which have had, especially The Existence of God, quite an influence, that's true. They're all books which I have, since I've been around many years, I've written totally rewritten second editions of them within the last few years. With the same general approach, but bring them up to date, refining them in various ways. The main themes of this book, the Coherence of Theism, is about what it means to say there is a God. God is supposed to be omnipotent, omniscient, everlasting, and so on. And I was concerned to spell out what it is to be omnipotent, what we're saying about God when we say he's omnipotent, which literally means can do everything. But nobody really can understand it that way, because obviously God can't make me exist and not exist at the same time, so one has to start spelling out what it is to be omnipotent, and likewise for being omniscient, for being eternal, and so on. And the book was called The Coherence of Theism because it was concerned to show that theism is an internally coherent view. It doesn't entail contradictions. There aren't any contradictions between supposing God to be omniscient in a certain sense and also to be free, for example. And then the existence of God claimed that there was good evidence for the truth of that. For the existence of God, it was I argued from the most general features of the universe, that there is a universe that is governed by simple and intelligible laws of nature, that these laws are such as to lead to the evolution of us, and that we are conscious beings. And I argued that the simplest and therefore most probably true account of this is that provided by traditional theism. And then in answer to the question, so what? Faith and Reason shows that it will rightly affect your conduct, what you believe about things, and it is rational to be guided by views which are not certain but are probably true in order to attain great goals, and in particular the great goal the Christian religion offers of life here and hereafter in interaction with God. So where did we got to? We got to somewhere around the year 1980, and after that I began to write on more particular matters, all of them related to Christian doctrine, although some of them are much more general philosophical interest. And I wrote a book called The Evolution of the Soul, which is about the relation between mind and body, and I hold that we are, each of us, a combination of a body and a separate soul, and that they are in interaction with each other. And so when we die, the body may decay, but the soul is there to be reunited with another body. I moved about that stage from Kiel to be a professor at Oxford. My chair is called the Professorship of the Philosophy of the Christian Religion, and that led to me writing 4 books on particular Christian doctrines. Responsibility and Atonement was about, its title implies, our responsibility for our actions and how the the life and death of Christ can provide an atonement for them. And then there was Revelation, about what would constitute a divine revelation and how we can recognize one. And then there was the Christian God, about the traditional Christian doctrines of the Trinity and the Incarnation, and then a book devoted solely to the problem of evil, why God would allow certain evils, in particular sin and suffering, to occur. And they formed a tetralogy, really, on Christian doctrine, and a separate book, although it wasn't technically part of the tetralogy, but it was the most down-to-earth book as regards Christian doctrine, which I've written, was The Resurrection of God Incarnate. And I argued there that in order to assess any big any historical claim of any deep significance, one has to take into account not merely the particular evidence of what happened at the time, but more general theories of how likely that was to have occurred. And I mean, if, for example, you are a physicist and you look through your telescope and you see a lot of specks in the sky moving outwards from a central point, you might think that this is a supernova explosion. But if you have a physical theory which says they can't have supernova explosions, then you could only recognize it as a supernova explosion if you could change your whole physical theory. Conversely, if you have a physical theory which says supernova explosions are likely to happen very often, then you don't need too much detailed historical evidence to suppose that one had occurred on any particular occasion. So likewise, with the resurrection of Christ, it matters very much whether you think you've got good evidence for a God who might intervene in history. If you have, you don't need too much historical evidence to suppose that it happened on a particular occasion. But if you have good reason to believe there's no God, or that if there's a God, he's not likely to intervene, you need an awful lot of historical evidence to suppose that Jesus is risen from the dead. And with that background, I then argued that we do have, well, I was assuming the arguments from the existence of God, we do have good reason to believe there's a God, and I argued that in virtue of his perfect goodness, he would want to become incarnate, and if he makes us suffer for a good cause, to identify with us by suffering with us. And with that background, I then argued, more detailed historically, that Jesus was just the sort of person that if he became incarnate, he would become incarnate as. And then I did argue the traditional arguments for the resurrection from the empty tomb and the appearances of Jesus. But my point is, New Testament scholars had utterly ignored the crucial importance of background evidence for assessing this sort of thing. So where do we get to from there? Well, I've written a couple of popular books explaining these things in simpler and shorter terms. My little book, Is There a God?, has been very successful, and then there was one on the Christian doctrines called Was Jesus God? After that, I have come back to writing again about mind and body. Mind, Brain and Free Will was published in 2012, and my latest work has been a second edition of The Coherence of Theism. I may have left something out, or one or two things out, but as you see, I've written quite a lot of books. And